I'm Ari Goldstein, the museum senior public programs producer, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program about Sweet Noise, Love in Wartime, a really wonderful book by Max Hirshfeld, which we'll dive into in detail shortly. The Holocaust is a difficult subject to grasp in its scale and in the depth of its impact on individual lives. Max Hirshfeld, an award-winning photographer, searched for decades for the right way to share his survivor parents' experiences, both their love story and the perseverance. The result of that long search was Sweet Noise, which combines letters with stunning photographs of his mother's return to Poland 5 decades after the war. The book is a powerful window into the legacy of the Holocaust, both on those who survived it and on the second generation. You can order it at the link in the Zoom chat. Max is here with us this evening for a conversation with Jacqueline Kott-Wolle, also a visual artist and the daughter of Holocaust survivors. Originally from Toronto, Jackie has lived in the Chicago area since 2005, where she studied at the Art Center of Highland Park and created a gorgeous series of paintings titled Growing Up Jewish, Art and Storytelling. We were privileged to host Jackie for an artist talk at the museum this past spring on Zoom, and we're really excited to be bringing her and Max together this evening to explore noise, love in wartime. Please feel free to share your questions in the Zoom Q&A box throughout the program, and we'll get to as many as we can towards the end of the hour. Without further ado, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. Jackie, feel free to kick us off.
Thank you, Ari. Max, first of all, congratulations on this wonderful book, Sweet Noise, Love in Wartime. And thank you for the honor of inviting me here tonight to help you launch it at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. I think this is going to be a really positive experience. And we have lots to talk about, so I don't want to waste a minute. In your book, at the beginning, you use a Polish word called powrót. Do you want to explain what that means for everyone here and how this beautiful book, Sweet Noise, came to be?
Thanks, Jackie. I would love to, and I appreciate this so much, and thanks to Ari and Sydney and everyone at the museum as well. Pardon me. In Polish, there is a word that has multiple meanings for the term return. Powrót can mean homecoming, or it can mean I'm going to the store, I'll be right back. When I first tackled creating a book about my parents' lives before, during, and after the Holocaust, the working title was Return. This is version 1. Interpreted this way, calling my mother's first return to Poland a spiritual return was apropos. But over the stop and start progress of my book, I began to realize that I too had been on a powrót to the place of my family's past without ever previously having stepped foot in there. A little backstory on the book's genesis. For everyone who's not familiar with it, in 1993, I escorted my mother to Poland on her first return in 46 years. I took 1 camera, 3 lenses, and 20 rolls of film with me, and tried very hard not to have expectations regarding what I may or may not experience. I took it so far before I left my home as to talk to a couple of magazine editors regarding this, and the advice I got was pretty much, go do it, then show us what you have. So I came back, and it took several months, maybe a year or so, to sort of come to terms with what I was looking at. And at some point, my father-in-law asked me if I wanted to do a book about it. And I said, I don't really think there's a book here, but I'll give it a whirl. So fast forward to many years, this is from 93 all the way till 99 when my mother passed. And I tried various iterations of the book through those years. She passed in 99. 2 or 3 years after she passed, I finally opened that box that she had given me before she passed. And inside that box was another box, and there were 700 plus letters that my parents had written to each other in their separation after the Second World War. When I found the letters, I knew that I had something. So let's assume we're in the early 2000s. I started working on a book again. And this is the second version of the book. I think that I was misguided in some ways because I was open to suggestions from others, and I signed with an agent who thought this was an ideal story for the young adult audience. So I worked very hard to reconstruct my narrative so that it would appeal to a 15-year-old, especially someone who may not have even heard of the Holocaust. So over those ensuing years, I went back and forth with this book and really tried hard to come up with something that felt right. But I didn't let it go. And Jackie and I will talk about this further, is that there was a drag on my soul, and I know on Jackie's soul with her work, that wouldn't let go. So I'll read you one quick line about this, and this relates to how this book finally came to be. In November 2018, I completed a commission to shoot in Africa that coincided with Paris Photo and offered me the opportunity to meet a publisher. With copies of my maquette in hand and my father's Paris-era wallet in my pocket, I knew I had nothing to lose. I introduced myself to several publishers, and 2 weeks later, I received a proposal from Damiani to publish Sweet Noise. So that's the genesis. That's what I've got. And I'd really love if you have anything to add, Jackie. Otherwise, I'm ready to share the screen, which will give the audience, I think, a better feel for the book.
Max, I think that's a great idea. Why don't you share your screen and show everybody that wonderful video that I so enjoyed. Let's do it.
Here we go. Separately surviving death marches, they found each other through an ad in a small newspaper in late 1945. When my father knocked on her door and heard her footsteps in the hall, he knew that they would marry. After only 9 months together and 9 days married, they endured a longer separation due to the chaos of immigration. It was only through the power of the press that after more than 3 years apart, they finally reunited in 1949. During their endless ordeal, my parents wrote to each other almost every day, and several years after I escorted my mother to Poland and photographed her attempts at closure, I discovered those more than 700 letters. Their remarkable love story helped create a book. Despite the odds, I am honored to be with you today, sharing their journey. As Michael Berenbaum writes in his essay, Sweet Noise is actually 2 books in one, each different in tone and tenor, each offering an insight powerful and poignant, sad and sobering, yet full of love. One is a book of letters, the other a narrative of pilgrimage, beautifully illustrated by a series of photographs.
December 18th, 1945, Paris. Dear Franya, I received your letter an hour ago, and you can only imagine what it meant to me. I felt deep in my soul that maybe it was you. I am alone in Paris now, living here for over half a year since American soldiers found me dying in Buchenwald, and thinking that I was French, sent me to Paris. I have a lot to write about, but I am leaving this for another time. Now I must ask some questions, and I need the answers. Are you alone? Do you have somebody? Because I more than want you to come here, I almost demand it. But I must know where things stand. My heart nearly exploded when I realized that I have finally found you. Writing is so hard because My handwriting is different from before. My hand is a little stiff, a souvenir from Warsaw. But please, write, I beg you, because I am waiting. It's been really hard for me here, and I was close to committing suicide. But the depression passed. I don't look well because I don't take care of myself. But my love, I didn't forget anything. I remember everything. Life is beautiful after all, and we should take advantage of it because we will never ever again get a gift like this. My sleep will be different tonight. My thoughts are and will be different as well, with different plans and different hopes after your reply. Farnusha, we found each other again, and don't make me wait too long. Make me happy again, at least with a letter, because the letter that is here in front of me is marvelous, like a beautiful dream that came true. I will write more later, but for now, I am waiting. Kisses. Your Ulek. December 21, 1945, Paris. My everything. We have to start from scratch, as if we were born again. I want to feel you next to me till my last days, to know that I have someone for whom it is worth staying alive. It came to life through all this suffering, through beatings, hunger and cold, through brutality, lice and bugs. To hell with what we went through. It is behind us now. When will I touch you, take you in my arms? If I could, I would fold myself into this envelope. Your Ulek.
October 1946, Jacksonville. My love, I found a paradise in my uncle's house. No words are adequate when talking about him except maybe an angel. He is an angel, not a human. His only goal now is to bring you over and to see us happy together. He keeps asking me if I like it here, and he does not let me cry, which unfortunately happens a lot, mostly because I can't believe all of this. Something like this we could only see in the movies before, you know? I am very happy here, but it is also very hard to be without you. They watch me all the time and make sure that I don't do anything and only rest. In the morning, the servant brings me breakfast in bed. Really, my darling, I have no words to describe all this. This really is an amazing country. It seems as if everybody lives well and that everybody is a real human being. I think you will like it here, and if not, I will go anywhere in the world with you. Today, my uncle opened a bank account for me in the name of Mrs. Julian Hirshfeld, though I have to be careful because my aunt knows how much money I have there. I really want to send you some money, but I'm not sure I can make decisions like that by myself yet. Your loving, Farnusha. April 20, 1947, Jacksonville. My love, I am going to New York to begin the process of applying for a passport. I don't want to be in America without you anymore. If our separation is too painful, maybe it would be better for me to leave America for a year, and like you said, maybe in a year we will be able to come back here together. Your Farnusha.
May 11, 1947. My everything. Yesterday I went to the American consulate. The consul did not see me, so I saw a vice consul, very young and very strict. I spent a long time there, and I spoke in English and in French. I almost cried when I was telling him about my life. I tried to stay calm and used my most beautiful French, but nothing worked. He refused to give me a visa, only because I was born in Poland. Your Julek.
September 10, 1947, New York. My love, I did not and will not cancel my trip. Nothing is as important as the fact that in 1 week I will be on a ship going to you. On September 17 at 4 p.m., I am boarding the SS America, which will arrive in Cherbourg on September 24 at 5 a.m. When you come to pick me up, please stay calm. We shouldn't be too sad, and we shouldn't get too excited. Wait, what am I writing? When I just think about seeing you, I go crazy. Your Franusha. May 10, 1948, Jacksonville. My love, 2 years ago you were waiting for me in Paris. Today it is 2 months since I returned to the U.S. Now both of us must be strong believers. Only then will we be together soon. We have to believe. Please go to the Canadian consulate and tell them that a textile factory has offered you a job. Your Franusha.
August 4, 1948, Paris. My everything. I speak to you all the time. I hold your hand and talk to you. I tell you how much I love you, that we will be together soon, and that we will never separate again. The good news is that I met with the journalists you mentioned, the husband and wife, and I told them everything. They are very interested in our story, and they talked with the consul about it. Your Julek.
October 4, 1948, Jacksonville. My love, 2 days ago, I got a phone call from the Saturday Evening Post. They said they want to come and take pictures of me. Then yesterday, someone else called my uncle for more details about himself. They asked if it was true he lost his entire family of 143 people. We sat down and counted all the people from both close and distant family lost during the war. We wrote back to confirm. Your Franusha.
June 1, 1949, Paris. My everything. I got a visa today. I am coming. I am coming. Thanks to Mr. Bess, I got the visa. They sent me a letter last night that the Consul General called Washington and explained the situation. He then received an additional number especially for me. After all these years of suffering and obstacles, I am allowed to be with you and stay with you for the rest of our lives. I just want to take you in my arms now and press you to my heart, with no words, just us together in that embrace. Your Julek.
9 years after Auschwitz, my parents settled in Decatur, Alabama, a small city on the banks of the Tennessee River that offered them a place far removed from their previous lives, a place where no one fully understood the man and woman with the blue numbers on their arms, but welcomed them anyway. By the time I was 9 or 10, I started to be aware that they had lived through a singular experience, and I was even proud of that fact in a naive, misguided way. Yet if my father took my hand while crossing the street, I would resist, sometimes even becoming embarrassed. His need to hold me was more complex than I could see, a need deep in a man who survived the unspeakable, clinging fiercely to what was his. It wasn't until after my father died and I turned 30 that I began to ask questions about Poland and my mother's memories of her home, of life in the ghetto and Auschwitz. Over the next few years, We discussed her desire to share her past and her need to show me the places she remembered. She told me that before she died, we would go there, to her world before. We began to plan a trip. I wanted to look through her eyes, older and seeing both the past and the present filtered through time. I hungered to share words with her that would fill in this uncharted territory. We stayed at the Hotel Bristol in Warsaw, that along with Nozick's synagogue was commandeered by the German military during the war. The hotel served as headquarters for the Gestapo, while the synagogue was used to house their horses. In the soft summer light of our first evening, we honored the Sabbath at Nozick, the only one of Warsaw's more than 400 synagogues to survive the war. That night, with barely enough men to form a minyan, my mother climbed the stairs to the second level of the sanctuary and waited patiently for the service to end. I quietly took pictures from the last pew, waiting for the voices of the men gathered before me to reach a level that would help muffle the sound of the camera. I sensed spirits living in the walls of the synagogue, an imposing structure soaked in history and surviving precariously in a place once teeming with Jewish life. On our first morning at the Jewish cemetery, we saw a simple exhibit dedicated to children where dozens of photographs are embedded in a rough masonry exhibit left open to the elements. Above the photographs is a poem on tablets that speaks of a young man's futile attempt to bring bread to his soon-to-be-killed mother. We traveled to Opatov and located the building where my mother was born. The entrance to the courtyard was through a dilapidated brick archway, and as we approached, I felt a cool dampness, as if a transparent presence moved with us through the air. Once inside, my mother stopped. Things grew uncomfortably quiet, and as she began to speak, it seemed that her persona altered, transformed by the kind of fleeting memory that leaves before it fully arrives. With no vegetation in sight, and just a few cracked tiles covered by the sooty evidence of where the coal was stored, the courtyard felt like a haunted place. Moving closer with my camera, I watched a great sorrow come across her face. She bit her lower lip and began to cry. Rather than consoling her, I photographed the moment, burying my sense of duty as her son in a split second of selfishness, silently welcoming the raw emotion. Watching my mother wrestle with her memories seemed to suck the air from my lungs. When I look at these photos of her, visibly shaken in that dismal place, I imagine her as a girl of 3, naively unaware of the cataclysmic events stretching out before her, playing and whispering, and secure in her tiny universe. Undoubtedly, that world had spun in a slower way, filled with promise and sweet noise. From Opatov, we moved on to Zawiercie and located the building where my mother was raised, on the street that was once named Adolf Hitler Strasse. A woman stood on the front steps, eyeing us suspiciously and holding a small dog. My mother showed her tattoo from Auschwitz to the woman, as she did with other strangers we met in Poland, and her act of defiance gave me pause. I was apprehensive and uncomfortable, yet deeply proud of her. It was part of her closure to tell her story to these Poles, to neighbors who had perhaps looked away or even cheered when the Jews were rounded up. When my mother returned to Europe in 1947, first to see my father in Paris, then to visit Zawiercie, she placed a new stone on her Aunt Zosia's grave. 46 years later, I photographed her in that cemetery, clutching a few flowers and gesturing toward where she remembered Zosia's resting place to be. She had arrived at this moment so certain of the grave's location that instinct propelled her movements. Once proud tombstones, testifying to centuries of Jewish life and death, were now at the mercy of the whims of nature, like the pitch and yaw of tiny boats in a raging sea. It was the short drive from Krakow to Auschwitz that moved us to the center of my mother's history and set the stage for the dark heart of our trip. After parking our car, I followed my mother through the hallways and up and down the stairs of Block 10, the site of notorious experiments by Joseph Mengele. Tourists wandered the hushed spaces, where piles of shoes, hairbrushes, and suitcases are displayed behind glass walls, hinting at the immensity of the dead. At the end of a long hallway on the second floor, my mother stopped to rest. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes, her shoulders wilting as her body sank onto the hard surface. Her weary posture and stoic expression suggested release, as if a dark bird, a scratchy, pent-up animal composed of 1,000 nightmares, had finally been liberated. At that moment, I witnessed both her clarity and defeat, fitting reminders of her deep resilience. When Auschwitz I proved inadequate to the task of gassing and cremating humans, the Nazis built a death camp on the former 400-acre potato farm in the village of Birkenau. On the day we visited, with the cloudy sky threatening rain, my mother and I stood on the track that runs through Birkenau. She began to describe that day in August 1943, when Nazi soldiers ordered her family into the street and forced them to the trains, but she stopped, grasping for language and light. Her face was a singular combination of defiance, laced with sorrow, an explosive mingling of emotions pulsing just under the surface. In the barracks at Birkenau, my mother showed me the platform where she had slept, crammed together with a half-dozen others. Alone in there with my mother, we stood between the shadows and something much darker. In that decrepit barn, designed to hold 52 horses, but instead housing 800 humans, I touched the wood of the twisted bunks lining the walls and caught my breath. I couldn't focus the camera, couldn't adjust to the fist in my stomach, or the smell of the memory of urine and death. Yet I continued to photograph this simple person, this still beautiful shadow of the child of 3, who had almost stopped looking toward the future. We walked slowly toward the train terminal, and once inside climbed toward the top of the guard tower that sits above the track. The whole of Birkenau spread at our feet. I hung back as we climbed, watching through a window as a police car pulled up in advance of the arrival of the Queen of Denmark. I turned to see that my mother had moved ahead, as if poised to take flight. Instinct took over, and I pushed the shutter. Maybe here in the tower was an infinitesimal slice of clarity, rooted in my mother's unwavering search for meaning. When I look at the picture of her in the guard tower, I see her climbing to heaven. I see someone who is both alive and already dead, moving toward the light. It was late afternoon when we left Birkenau, and the sky began to clear. We headed north through the heavy terrain, passing farms and villages with names that seemed plucked from ancient vines. The sky grew dark as we sped toward our destination. I wanted to say the right things, but my throat felt constricted, my emotions a tangled maze of thickened blood and blackened earth. My turn at the wheel of her closure was drawing to the end.
Right, Max. Wow. And this is it's so beautiful. And I've seen this video a few times already. And every time I see it, it becomes more and more emotional and poignant. I have to catch my breath before I even speak with you tonight. What an incredible thing you have done for yourself, your family. Really, and it's an honor to be speaking here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So what I thought I would do maybe is to set the stage for everybody so that they can understand what it is that I'm doing here with you tonight. And why don't I'm going to share with everybody what you and I have in common. First of all, we're both members of the second generation, but I would describe us as like the bookends of the experience of that. You're sort of from the first crop babies born to Holocaust survivors, and I am probably from the last crop because my parents were children during the Holocaust. We're both artists, and we both chose to use our art forms to tell our family story of surviving the Holocaust and what it meant to be raised by people who had difficult pasts that were characterized by loss and suffering. And in this process, you with your camera, me with my paintbrush, we found a way to uncover the past, try to make sense of our parents, the personal histories that were cut away from us, and try and also understand ultimately what meant to be a second generation and the experience of straddling two worlds. But we have something else that is really lucky about the two of us that I want to share. And I want to show something, a slide that Ari's going to put up. That's something uplifting. And here it is. It's an example of my work, a painting that I made of my parents under the chuppah, and this absolutely adorable photograph of your parents. So what we see here are all of these people are Holocaust survivors, all of them. And these images that we're working off of were shortly after liberation. And what we see are people who are choosing optimism, choosing love, choosing the future, and embracing the next chapter of their lives. So I thought this would be a nice way to sort of bring the two of us together for tonight. And Max, what I'd like you to do now is maybe talk about this photo of your parents. Tell us the story of Ulick and Franja and how they met and what you want to share with us about your parents.
Thank you. I think that's a beautiful comparative set of images. In terms of the amount of time this could take, I want to make sure that I'm concise with the information. My father was born in 1907. When he was 9 years old, he played piano with the Warsaw Philharmonic. He was a child prodigy, and as he's told me, child prodigies rarely go on to become famous in their form. He had to go to school in France because in Warsaw in 1925, Jews were told to stand in the back of the class in med school. So he went to school in Strasbourg and Mulhouse in France, and which was paid for by a woman that he did not love, but whose father offered to pay with the understanding that he would come back to Warsaw and marry her, which he did after gaining his doctorate in textiles. I tell you this story because the reason my father ended up in Zawiercie and eventually met my mother was because he was working at IG Farben in a small town outside Zawiercie and called Miszków, and as the director of research, and because of the way that Zawiercie was set up as one of the last ghettos to be liquidated, he didn't go into the ghetto until early 1943. Ironically, if you know a little bit about how the ghettos were set up, the people were forced into very small quarters, and it turned out that my father and his wife and daughter and his mother were in a flat directly below the flat that my mother was in with her uncle and aunt who had raised her. So they met, they fell in love very, very fast, from my understanding from the letters and from understanding, putting the dates together. They were both taken in August and September of 43 to Auschwitz. They both survived, and as the book explains, they found each other because my mother put an ad in a newspaper looking for Julian Hirshfeld, and someone saw it. My father was in Paris, my mother was in Brussels. Subsequently, the photo is when they had finally reconnected in Brussels. All that's on the back of the photograph says Brussels 1946.
Wow, what an unbelievable story. It's a lot to process.
It is, it's a lot to unpack, I know that.
It is. So let's get to your book. First of all, it's obvious you are a gifted photographer, and there's nothing to say that just because you can take a picture or you can paint or, play the violin or anything, that you can also write. But you are also a phenomenal writer. And your words, in contrast to what the Holocaust was, which was graphic and violent and undignified, your words are so nuanced and respectful and beautiful. And all of it together just tells me that you're a good son. Like, truly, you're a good son. So my question now to you is, did the process of creating this book change you?
Of course, it had to. And keep in mind, I had a wealth of material to deal with. And one of the reasons that the book took these 20 plus years to put together was because I didn't know how to put it together as a book. So between the vintage material, the photographs I had taken, the letters, the article in the Saturday Evening Post, there was so much to both lay out on the table and then figure out how to edit that the task was daunting. And I think in the process, the biggest gift of all was discovering the letters, because I had been struggling with how to tell the history of that period without sounding like a wannabe historian. And when I got the first few translations, I immediately realized that a first-person narrative of two people who survived, it wouldn't tell us exactly what it was like, but it would tell us enough so that why would I try to tell this story having the real thing in front of me? So the book changed me because it allowed me to focus on the important facts and also keep it in a linear fashion, because the book follows a timeline, and which I think is important because ultimately I didn't come into the picture till 1951, and so by that time they were happily ensconced in America.
So we made a decision before tonight that we're going to focus more on the pauvre route, the journey, but I think we should give a little attention to the letters. The video doesn't convey this quite as well as the book, but what you see in the book is a lot of suffering, the pain of separation. Your parents were apart for years. They were longing for each other. They were wanting each other. And we had a funny moment. I'm working on a painting now where I'm doing a Pesach scene, and I happen to have a Haggadah with me in my studio. And as I was reading this book, I kept thinking, there's something familiar about this pain of them longing for each other. And when I had a moment where I realized, oh, wait a second, it says in the Haggadah, it describes in the Haggadah that the separation of husband and wife, the enforced separation of husband and wife, was like the pain of slavery. It was the affliction of slavery. And so here are your parents, two people who went through Auschwitz, and then being apart like that and not knowing how long it would take for them to come back together was like another assault on them in a way, right? Like they were so desperate to start their lives.
Well, the most important thing is, if in the keynote, I showed briefly a telegram from Uncle Harry, that it's important to understand that my mother had reached out to Uncle Harry, the only surviving member of her family who lived in Jacksonville, Florida, as soon as she was brought to Brussels and was brought back to a certain degree of health. She had reached out to him, and he immediately told her to start applying for a visa to come to the United States. So this is in summer, early fall of 45. My father and mother didn't find each other till December of 45. So that even though that was a crucial moment in their reconnection, they decided, after reconnecting January 45, they decided that she should proceed with going to America, because my father then applied for his visa. And the crush of people in Western Europe who survived was so daunting that within those few months, the process of getting a visa was virtually put him at the back of a line of 800 people in Paris. So what we learn in the book is that there's this desperate man in Paris living what he hopes is going to be his dream come true, because remember, he was not in a happy marriage, though he had a daughter that he loved dearly. He's not in a happy marriage, and here he finds himself surviving Auschwitz, surviving a death march, and finding this woman that he had this brief moment of passion with right before taking. So I think that when one sees the letters, there's a dominant thread here of a desperate man who many times in the letters says, I'm so sorry I let you go. I made the second biggest mistake in my life, or the third, or the biggest mistake. So ultimately, there was I believe, and my mother's ensconced in Jacksonville, obviously happy in this lap of luxury, but only for a little while, because I think the facade was starting to crack very early. She makes a comment in there how she has to be careful that Aunt Pearl knows how much money she has in her bank account. So the letters are such a powerful entity here, and it took me a long time to find a good translator. So keep in mind, there's 700 letters, and most of the letters are not single page. They're many pages. So the editing process and the bringing the language up to current, the way we talk, was really kind of vital to this. So I'd say there's 10% of the letters in the book. So I won't keep going about the letters, but that really forms, as you know, half the book.
Yes. So actually, just one last observation about the letters, which will take us to the next part of our discussion. What we see here is your father's voice seems to dominate the narrative of the letters. And he's expressing some pretty intense emotion, like from complete elation to finding your mom to wanting to commit suicide at one point. I mean, he is sharing the whole gamut of feelings, everything he's got. And your mom is like, she's more demure. She's almost like that traditional female role of her day, trying to keep his intensity down and trying to keep him calm. Never mind the fact that she herself went through Auschwitz and lost her whole family. She doesn't share much about herself in those letters. It's really all his voice. So here we are. Sorry.
No, you go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So what I thought was so we jump to the second part of your book. Here's your mother. She's widowed. She's older, and she is now at the front and center of your camera. She's gonna go back to Poland and take you on her turf, and she's in charge. So I thought this was a really important image. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what's going on here and maybe your relationship to your camera in this moment?
That's an excellent question. And in fact, I think that this photo and the one toward the end of the book of my mother climbing the steps at Birkenau are the result of a relatively long career of photographing / observing life as it comes in front of me. So I think that my ability took over in these places. My instinct, as it were, took over in these moments. And it's impossible to fully understand what I think occurs in these moments, but that I think that at the same time, it becomes a core response that it puts the photographer / observer on a plane that everything else drops away, and the recognition of this moment. And that's what happened here. And there's a moment in the book where I talk about a similar occurrence where she showed her tattoo to a gas station attendant, but I didn't photograph that. But I think that ultimately this photo has probably resonated more with people than almost any photo in the book.
I feel like I know her. I mean, my husband's grandmother's from Opato, so I kind of am, conjuring up Bubba Frida too, but I feel like she's this plucky, strong woman who's just doesn't care what you think. She's just going to tell this lady what she needs to say, which is, she rolls up her sleeve. I like how she's looking up and how the Polish woman is looking down. I thought that was compositionally very interesting. as
It
well.
is, and it's one of those things one cannot ever plan to do. And keep in mind, my mother was born in El Pato, but at the age of 5, she was sent to live with her aunt and uncle, who were wealthier than her mother. Her own mother, my mother's father, had passed before she was born, so that my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, couldn't raise two daughters. So she sent her to live. So I think there was this displacement of her parents, and actually were her aunt and uncle. And if, as you noticed in the beginning of the book, there's a reference to my meeting Ellen Soika, who I have no idea of the relation, but I like to think that there's a connection here, that I meet the woman with the same last name as Abraham and Zosha Soika. And I say all this because I think my mother embraced the fact that she was raised by a comfortable Jewish family. As she would tell me, they had a housekeeper, they had someone who drove the carriage. My uncle had her uncle had a coal business, and they supplied. Therefore, because his business was so successful, they could live in that building, which on the main floor was the town hall, and the second floor was their apartment. So they were given access to this place that not normal. So the confrontational moment, which was really quick with that woman, was really remarkably powerful. Keep in mind, I'm hearing this in Polish, so I'm not necessarily understanding specifically, but it's pretty obvious what was going on.
Mm-hmm. So why don't you mentioned something about a Jewish home. So why don't we segue into the next photo? This is the synagogue in Warsaw. You have this amazing quality in your writing where you conjure up spirits and ghosts. And especially somehow I felt like with this synagogue that was, empty-ish, and it has a minyan. But that feeling that it's soaked in history. And do you want to talk about that feeling of ghostliness on your trip?
Well, this illustrates it probably as well as anything else. And I think that what happened, Jackie, is that in the end, I was able to go back and forth with my writing of the experiences by having the photography to refer to. And I think what happens is, at least for me, information pours out as I'm looking at the photograph. I'm thinking about a multitude of things. I'm thinking about how I wasn't raised with a synagogue like this in my life. I'm thinking about the fact that the Gestapo put their horses into this building, this sacred place. I'm thinking about there were over 400 places of worship for Jews in Warsaw. This was the one still remaining, and obviously it wasn't torn down because the Gestapo was using it. I also like to be a voyeur, and when I was in college, I always sat in the back of the class so I could observe all the people in the classroom, and I could hear enough about what the professor might be saying. But it's the same thing that happens to me often, both when I go to the movies, and certainly happened to me here. I don't know if we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I might have been the 10th man in this group. And if you look carefully at the top left corner, there's my mother at the railing. And I even fantasize about this man looking at her, and he's wondering, who is that?
Well, it's funny because when I look at your mother at the top there in the women's section, next to her is a young woman, and it's like her back in time, like there's like the younger version of herself. So that was that kind of, I don't know, it sat with me also as I studied this particular photo.
Well, it connects real briefly with me with the idea that we discussed of memory tourism. And ultimately, in 1993, there weren't a lot of American Jews that we met in Warsaw or in Auschwitz or Birkenau. It was virtually empty. Ari told me this remarkable statistic that there are over 2 million people who have visited Auschwitz. And I don't know if that's year by year or not. Ari can probably confirm that, but I'm blown away. And I also think that this could not have occurred today the same way. So, my mom gave me a couple of gifts. One was this trip, obviously, where I could use my talents, and the other was not throwing away those letters.
Mhm. Let's just talk a little minute. You said something about the synagogue that you wanted to wait for the sound of the minyan to muffle out the sound of your camera clicking on, I assume, on Shabbat, right? So you're taking pictures.
Of course, I shouldn't be.
You reference sound in your writings. You talked about being a boy and putting the covers over your head to muffle the sound of your father's wails in his nightmares. And most notably, you called this book Sweet Noise. So is this something subconscious? Did you purposely reference sound, or you want to talk about that a little bit, like that, and the title?
It's very subconscious, and I think you heard me mention the term sweet noise, which comes from the text. And I had a title for the book called Return or Povrut, but once I started writing, the title popped out at me. And interestingly, my publisher suggested that we should have a subtitle because sweet noise is sort of opaque. Mm-hmm. No one really quite knows what it is, but I was adamant because this is what I had led myself to believe was the appropriate title. I think that historically there's a lot of people in photography, a lot of well-known photographers, and I'm not necessarily putting myself in that mix, but that music is an integral part of their background and their practice and so forth. And so I see that as something that's in tandem with the observations, because music, of course, can be so visual to us, be it a Beethoven concerto or be it something current. And I think that for me, that happens frequently, so that I believe that ultimately I never noticed what you noticed, and I think that makes it really special to me. I will say one thing, that as a photographer and you don't have a tripod, you're looking for a place to put your camera so that it doesn't move very much. So on the back of the last pew in the synagogue, if you put it on the back of the pew in front of you, you've got a braceable place to keep the camera. Also, cameras that I traveled with were somewhat noisier when the shutter shot. So I think at one point a gentleman turned around, but of course I was looking the other way. So.
All right, so I just got a note from Ari. We got to move this along.
Okay.
I really want to show a picture that was not in your film, and I think it's a sensitive image. Ari, if you can go to the next slide. And this is difficult territory. Let's look at these images here you have of your mom as she visited and hugged a fellow survivor in her small apartment in Poland, and sitting on the table were framed photos of this woman's children who perished during the Holocaust. And there's a quote that I'd like to read just to kind of share what's going on here in your words. You said, "She pointed to the pictures of her children who were killed during the war, and I was startled to find myself thinking that they too are children of a survivor. My half-sister did not survive the war. I didn't know of her existence or that my father had been married in the 1930s until I was a teenager, and he showed me her photo. Staring at the face of this long dead sibling, I felt as if my life were both weighty and flimsy. I was here, she was not, but it seemed completely random that this was so. I have never let being the child of survivors become an identity. It has simply been a fact of my life. But now I wondered if this fact made me different from other people. As I learned about the Holocaust, I could not shake the thought that I am here only because of it. It seemed like an accident that I was born at all." So, Max, this is powerful stuff. And I think there's a lot for you to unpack here. You have a half sibling who is a victim of the Holocaust, but you stated very well, you and me, we are accidents of history. If not for the Holocaust, we wouldn't exist. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Of course. And this is a woman that my mother didn't know, but she got the name of. So I think we were both relatively surprised. She lived in a one-room apartment. And the sentiment that I think you're so eloquently raising connects in a way with the next quote that I think you pulled about my sense about the Holocaust being this giant, as I describe it, a heavy black door closing on me. And in the end, we discussed this as well, that I wasn't raised in a community of survivors. So my parents' lives were really beautifully softened and quiet for a long time, living in Decatur, Alabama. But and they tried hard. I was bar mitzvahed, and they tried as much as they could. But ultimately, I think that I don't know if there's positives and negatives, or it's all this kind of gray mass of the children of survivors picking parts of their background to focus on. And I was fortunate, like I've said, that I had this journey with her that I could photograph and then come back and many years later start to analyze, how did that really represent? And I appreciate your saying that I'm a good writer, and I do love writing. However, it's a challenge, but I found that when you have material as rich as these photographs, and you have material as rich as these letters, that the writing needed to be honed down and edited tightly so that my voice could speak out. And I think that it's obvious photography shouldn't have to be explained. I think it's wonderful when it leaves more questions than answers. But I think that language, and I've been accused in the past of trying to be too poetic, but ultimately, I think that the less poetry, the more powerful.
So Max, we had 4 things to talk about, but it looks like we're wrapping up. That's the fastest hour ever. But Ari, if there are any quick questions that we can do, maybe that would be wonderful if you want to bring it forward to us. But my suggestion is everyone should use this as read this book for their book groups. I think it would be phenomenal material to unpack. So thank you.
Normally we're kind of strict on time, but you guys have so much that you prepared. I don't know if you want to, if we're able to run 10-15 minutes late, you want to take a couple more minutes to revisit some of these photos, and then we'll throw in 1 or 2 audience questions.
I'm good if you're good. It's really.
Yeah, I'm here. I got nowhere to go.
Okay. All right. Because
you brought that up. Actually, I was trying to consolidate the time there a little bit. Frankly, because of it's almost the hour's up. But when I brought up about the heavy black door, it's really important to understand that I think when you don't have something in your background like that you crave it because you read about it or you see it in movies. However, in retrospect, the real gift that they gave themselves was by moving to a small town. From what I believe it was done in the late 80s, early 90s, Helen Epstein's book, Children of the Holocaust, is really a pretty remarkable landmark book. And I believe there's several children of survivors that grew up in the South that are featured in there. One, I believe, was a beauty queen in South Carolina. And I bring this up because in the end, the suffocating nature of growing up in New York or Toronto or Montreal, Chicago, surrounded by other survivors, may not have produced what my mother decided to do. And I say that only because perhaps if she had half a dozen friends, let's say in a survivor ghetto in Toronto, that she may not have felt compelled to go and figure out what this really represented. But she was on her own. My father had passed. She had a very rough 10 or 11 years after he passed, so that by her deciding to do this, and I, God love her, I couldn't let her go do this by herself. And I was also being selfish. I had this opportunity. It's very rare that any of us have that.
So now that we have a couple more minutes, Ari, would you maybe put up the next photo, which you called in the book, the dark heart of your journey. This is the most bizarre picture ever because it's the crematoria at Auschwitz and there's a lace curtain over the window. And most of me wonders, why would anybody put a lace curtain in Auschwitz? You asked a good question about the man who worked there. Like, what would motivate somebody to put on a suit and tie, sit at a desk that a Nazi had sat at before, and work there every day in his short life. I mean, truth really, really is stranger than fiction. And I just thought this juxtaposition was unbelievable.
Well, it's interesting.
Yeah, go on.
We had the name of this gentleman, and we had scheduled an appointment with the director of the what it has at the time even had become a museum facility. And I say this because when we got to Auschwitz, we had a guide who took us through, who was from the front office. But then sitting in this room, and I keep in mind, by this point, I had understood that most Polish homes, even the people who weren't so wealthy, almost always have this lace curtain in front. So I look at it as more of a cultural application. The juxtaposition of it is striking. The fact that the windows open just told me we were there in July and it was hot. But what I find very compelling is, at the time, I had the urge to ask my mother to stand inside the curtain, and I didn't do it. And I don't know if it really would have been successful, but as a photographer, it's very easy to then pick apart facts in the image. This man, this whole block at Auschwitz had been turned into a museum. They had a classroom with art on the walls that was from inmates. Anyway, so I'm glad it's also a photo that resonates with a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. So you had mentioned the Holocaust being a heavy black door. I'm going to read this quote because I think it'll begin an interesting conversation about Jewish identity also. So, and that's something I thought you and I were going to address a little bit here. So let me read this quote from your book. On page 134, you say, "For me, the Holocaust was a heavy black door that had slammed shut on my history. Relatives vanished with the snap of a whip. Uncles, aunts, and cousins with odd names I had never heard in my small Alabama town were sent to die with a simple pointed finger. It was different for my parents. They could recall their murdered families by tapping into a collective centuries-old memory made up of their old lives and the lives of dozens of relatives. Growing up Jewish in Poland before the war meant not knowing another way. It meant a pure segregation with those of the same tribe, a history that went on and on unabated. Though I was raised in a Jewish household and became a bar mitzvah, Polish Judaism remained a murky gray unknown. When I watched my father stand up during high holidays to recite Yizkor prayers in a loud, authoritative voice, I felt proud yet confounded all at once. I had no reason to join him, no warm memory to visit." For me, this quote summarizes the pain that Hitler continues to inflict on us, the second generations. The narrative of our communities, our history was violently cut. We grew up like Swiss cheesing. There's holes and we're trying to fill them in. And for you had these Jewish spaces, these identity spaces that you couldn't fill. You didn't have the feeling of warmth toward your Jewish life. Do you want to expand on that a little bit more and where you are now with your Judaism?
Yes, I guess.
Sort of. It's not Hebrew school. You don't have to.
No, it's okay. I really appreciate this. And ultimately, when I wrote this, I didn't know that I felt this. But then when I wrote it, I remember vividly realizing that when one has a long history, it could be in New England with an old Brahmin family, it could be a Jewish family that was here for many generations. Ultimately, I didn't have that at all. So that the fact that it existed for them was something, and maybe I was imagining this, but when my father would stand up and recite Yizkor, he would be able perhaps to tap into a memory of doing the same thing with his father and the same thing his father with his father. And knowing what we know about Judaism in Poland, certainly was predominantly, if not fully, Orthodox. So there was this very isolated specificity of religion that was shared by, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And I like to think that I can tap into that because I know the details, but I have a lot of personal issues with embracing it because I didn't grow up with it in my DNA, in my cultural DNA, and therefore I grapple with it. I was bar mitzvahed. My parents tried hard, I believe, to introduce me to High Holy Days and to. We had Passover service every year, and we would invite the same Scottish man that worked with my father at Monsanto. But other than that, there was no community, and I think that's the key. The key word is that sense of community.
Wow. Okay, Max, one more picture. Let's circle back to your mom. So you said she went on this pauvroute journey to attempt closure. How was she affected by this trip? Did it change her? And do you know if any part of her achieved a sense of closure as a result of this experience?
Well, it's interesting. You and I talked about this briefly. I actually remember showing her the photographs, some of the photographs just as prints, 6 months after we returned. And I remember that she was hesitant to talk much more about anything more about mostly about how she looked in the photos, not about what her emotions were. And I think perhaps the connection that came up in the letters that you really picked up on beautifully is that she, until she was able to go on this journey and decide to do it, she played the dutiful wife. She played the dutiful niece in Jacksonville. She was always a demure person, and therefore my memory of her articulation is really not as clear as what we read in my father's letters. I say that only because I can only judge her closure as an attempt at closure. I don't know if one can ever fully have closure. I think that I had better closure on this than perhaps she did. It's a very hard word. I don't think that it's very, very difficult. I think there's always threads that pull you back into the deciding process of closure.
Well, Max, I'm going to finish with a couple of remarks. First of all, you have this rare gift of taking near perfect photographs, but then what's so uncanny is that your words are so vivid. In my mind, I can't distinguish, I get pictures in my head from your words, and I almost can't remember which ones I actually saw on the page and which ones you just described beautifully. So just kudos to you for all of that. And the other thing I want to thank you for is for, I guess, naming and giving form to the sort of otherness, the uneasiness of being a second generation, and just helping people like you and me kind of tap into understanding who we are and where we came from. I think you've done a lot for anybody who is a second generation to just look at how they grew up and understand, some of the questions that why was I a little out of step? I was like everybody, but not like everybody. And all those questions that they really were crystallized in your writing and in your photographs and in this book. So I thank you really from the bottom of my heart for all of it, for letting me speak and do this with you.
Well, I appreciate that. Michael Birnbaum mentions that at the end of his essay, and just for the audience to know, there's 2 essays in the book. Michael's essay starts the book. It's called The Breath of Death. And the book is finished with Stuart Eisenstadt wrote an essay called Imperfect Justice. So there's an interesting book ending to this, but Michael talks about how other children of second generation may be envious of what I had, which was this story and my camera. But I say that because the idea that the existence of this propelled me over those many years of not doing a book to not forget to do a book. And therefore, I would wake up in the middle of the night, not all the time, but I would say to myself, I have to go do something with this. So I think that the most important part was that by being able to share it with you and with other 2G, and now certainly with 3G individuals, is a remarkable gift that I feel wonderful that I can share this with the world. I give a lot of kudos to my Italian publisher, which gave me a chance to go to Bologna for a week, so that's an extra benefit. But ultimately, I appreciate that very much. I don't know if there's any 2G or 3G people that have made comments or not in the audience.
So I'm going to ask you one last question before Ari takes over. What's next for this? What do you plan? What do you see?
Well, I've actually been because of COVID, I started thinking about trying to produce a traveling exhibition with the work, and I'm moving forward with that. And I say that because the nature of an exhibition is different than a book, and it's different than a keynote presentation. And through COVID, because of COVID, I've learned that the museums are all clamoring for material, and they're opening back up, but they have to be very sensitive to how much they put on the walls and what's involved. So thank God I have the photography to really carry an exhibition, but I think that I would hurt myself if I didn't have a smattering of the letters somehow that tie in here. So I'm learning, I'm on a big learning curve now. So the goal is a traveling exhibition, so stay tuned.
Can't wait. All right, Ari, please take over.
Let's take 2 audience questions. Max, David asks, are there plans to publish the book in Poland?
Oh, that's a great question. My translator would love to do that. And in fact, she has suggested that there be 2 volumes, one just to the letters and just the book. I hope that could occur, and I think that perhaps that's one of the extra things that we should pursue. There's a phrase in one of the letters that I don't believe we talked about, but my father said that these letters were like paper bridges, so that eventually he would hope people could read them as a memoir. So of course, when I read that, I was blown away. It was very emotional to read, but the title of Paper Bridges is really a beautiful title for something like that. So fingers crossed. Does he know any great publishers in Poland?
Hopefully. And one more question from Lisa, who asks, when your images are viewed as fine art objects removed from the story and narrative around them, what do you hope for the audience to take away?
A very good question. Part of the grappling with how to design the book, which I had done in several iterations, as I mentioned, was that I kept thinking that it was important to see a photo and a text next to each other so that you could ultimately have an understanding. But I'm also a proponent of showing and not telling, so that I think that based on the simplicity of this type of documentary work, that the photos would tell enough and leave questions. But I think that ultimately an exhibition is going to have to answer that question, and I'm not there yet with understanding how to embrace that.
Max, thank you so much for sharing your story and your art with us this evening. Jackie, thank you so much for being our insightful, excited moderator. This was really a wonderful conversation. Our audience can order Sweet Noise, Love in Wartime at the link in the Zoom chat. We did record this evening's program, and you will all receive an email from us tomorrow with a link to the recording and some other suggested links and resources that you may find interesting. We hope you'll stay connected to the museum and join us for some of our upcoming programs, including our next artist talk on December 16th with Naomi Harris. So just a great big thanks to everyone, and especially to both of you, Max and Jackie.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
Take care.